Hey YouTube, what's going on? I'm Greg. Welcome back to my machine shop. Well, we've been making great progress on our Wallaby 30cc engine, so much so that it's time to start putting it together. Today, we're going to assemble the crankshaft. All right, let's go. So the next assembly we've got is the crankshaft assembly. This is drawing 1006000. It's a better picture here, exploded view. Here's our parts list on page 4. We're going to start with the flywheel and this little magnet here. This is what triggers our ignition system. Got a magnet here, 4mm by 1.5mm. We need to figure out which is the North Pole and which is the South Pole. I do that using a Hall sensor that I have here, and if I pass it over one direction, you can see it triggers even pretty far away. If I flip this magnet over and present the North Pole, which in this case I do not have Sharpie on, over the top of the Hall sensor, it does not trigger the Hall sensor. But if I present the black side, which is the South Pole, I believe, it does trigger the Hall sensor. So I'm going to mount the black side facing out on the flywheel here. This will be when this is straight up, top dead center. My Loctite. And I'll use this instead of super glue. There we go. I use the blue thread locker Loctite on the 440 screws that secure the counterweights to the crankshaft. I want to pause here and make a quick note that I think is really important. Before we Loctite our counterweights into place, we need to make sure they're oriented correctly. The counterweights are wider than the crank webs, and they are biased inwards towards the con rods. So please note that the outside of the crank webs here are flush with the outside of the counterweights, but there's a smaller gap between each counterweight where the con rod connects to the crank pins. Hope that makes sense, because this is really important. You don't want to Loctite the counterweights in place incorrectly. Next, we've got our crank shaft. We've already mounted the counterweights and Loctited these in. We drilled 1/4-inch lightning holes through the crank pins. This space needs to be sealed on both ends at the crank web because the internal cavity is part of our oil gallery that delivers oil from the crankshaft middle main bearing to the crank pins, lubricating the connecting rod big end. I turned some simple aluminum plugs on the lathe, 1/4 inch in diameter and 3/16 inch long, and Loctited them into place. Then finished them flush with the crank webs. The flywheel goes on this end here. Put our main bearing on first. And then put our split collar on. Line up the slot in the split collar with the keyway in the crankshaft. Install our key, which in our case is just a 1/16 inch dowel pin, and then slip on our flywheel. The keyway in the flywheel will also line up with our dowel pin and ensure that the electronic ignition triggering magnet embedded in the flywheel is lined up at top dead center. Install our washer and our retaining nut, and then tighten it down. Next we have our front end main bearing. This is a test gear that I made. We're going to be making all of the gears in another installment. The drive pinion, this one here, will end up being steel, and all the other gears will be brass. I've made a set of gears, set of test gears, this one out of brass and the rest of them out of aluminum, but they're just temporary. Page 3 shows the exploded view of the front end. We've got our bearing and our bearing holder. We've got our drive pinion. We got our dowel. Goes on like yay. Our water pump pulley. And finally, our starter dog. And that will complete the crank shaft assembly. It'll drop in there like yay. Next up, we'll install our piston assemblies and the crankshaft and the sump to complete our short block. Oh, well, we've got the camshaft. All right, well, that completes the crankshaft assembly. Next up, we'll complete the full short block. And after that, we'll complete the head assembly. All right, making good progress, as we said earlier. Well, I'm Greg. Thanks for visiting me in my machine shop. Until next time, take care.